Joy Division were a Manchester band formed out of the massive punk rock movement in the UK in the late 70s. The band were formed after two of the members saw a Sex Pistols gig, so they were pretty much punks themselves, but unlike the Pistols and other similar bands, Joy Division favoured slower tempos and a greater focus on creating an atmosphere within their music. This style of music would become known as post-punk. Still a bit sloppy, but with far more ambition than the Pistols. And while most punk bands at that time were probably telling the Queen of the government to fuck off, Joy Division were more inward, with frontman Ian Curtis singing about his insecurities and the troubles in his own life. The band released 2 albums in their short time together, Unknown Pleasures in 1979 and Closer in 1980. Closer was released a month after the band tragically dissolved, as Curtis had committed suicide the day the band was set to embark on their first tour of North America. Joy Division were a band cut down in their prime, but even with their small output, they still managed to cement themselves as the most influential band in post-punk, and the goth scene as well. But enough introducing, let's get into what the albums were like. And I'm going to review the albums in order of how common the album art is on t-shirts. So we're starting with Unknown Pleasures. So yeah, this was the band's debut album. Before this album, they released a self-produced EP called An Ideal for Living, with songs that were pretty raw and a lot more closer to typical punk rock. However, by the time they got to work on this album, they had become a lot gloomier and more distinct. And a lot of this gloom and distinctness can be attributed to the man who produced the majority of the band's recordings, Mr. Martin Hannett. Hannett was a bit of an oddball, to put it simply. The guy loved to create a unique sound within the songs he produced, usually through adding a shitload of effects, but he also imposed himself into Joy Division sound in other weird ways.
Right, stop. We've got a rattle. We're going to have to dismantle the whole fucking kit.
You are?
What I'd like is to rebuild it on the roof. Yeah?
On the actual roof of the studio?
Hannett's spacious production, combined with the band's brooding and often down-tempo grooves, makes Unknown Pleasures feel rather chilling sometimes. And if you take most bands that are linked to some sort of punk scene and analyse their music a lot, you'll probably realise that most of these musicians involved aren't really all that good at playing their instruments. That's basically what punk was built on, wasn't it? It proved you didn't have to be a virtuoso to make entertaining music. And Joy Division certainly proved this as well. Bernard Sumner still played some pretty sick riffs, and he had a pretty good range of dynamics within his playing. And Ian Curtis, honestly, his pitch was flatter than Earth. Hashtag wake up sheeple. You could really feel the emotion and passion in his singing most of the time, so that kind of made up for it, I think. Like, there's these great moments on Unknown Pleasures where he changes from his deeper croon and raises his voice in songs like Shadow Play, Day of the Lords, and Disorder. And it's actually pretty amazing. Disorder was actually the first Joy Division song that got me into them, and you know what I first heard it in? Skate Bloody 3. I don't really know if the song really fit on the soundtrack all that well, but I couldn't really care less because it's a killer song. Also, Skate 4 went! Now that song's one of the more kind of upbeat, if you can call it that, songs on Unknown Pleasures, alongside Interzone, which is the closest thing to a proper punk rock song on it. But there's mostly songs like Day of the Lords and Candidate, which are dirges full of trademark Curtis anguish, the latter being punctuated by some strange droning sounds. She's Lost Control is another more danceable track on the album, though it's also about a girl dying from an epileptic fit, so like, you really want to dance to that? Meanwhile, Sumner's driving guitar makes Shadow Play a standout track, whilst Hook's bouncing bass pushes the song Wilderness. And the last track is the slow build of I Remember Nothing, with spooky synth ambience and stark drumming, as the song gradually escalates with Sumner's guitar jumping in and out of the mix and Hook cutting in with bass notes at random. And in typical Martin Hannett fashion, there's a bunch of other random sounds thrown in as well. So Unknown Pleasures is a fairly bleak album, but it's also a musically rewarding one. Now, Joy Division's next album was sadly, of course, their last, and it picked up where Pleasures left off for the most part, but it still had plenty of differences. So it's basically the same as Pleasures, but different. The album was released posthumously after the death of Ian Curtis, so by calling the album Closer, they were reminding everyone that this was really the end of Joy Division. Songs on Closer, according to Sumner, were written in 2 distinct periods. The first period spawned the more guitar-driven tracks on the album, And the second period brought the songs that were led by synthesizers. Yes, there were a lot more synths on this album than Unknown Pleasures. I'm pretty sure Sumner built his own synth that he used on this album, so yeah, he'd become a bit of a synth nerd by this point. That's definitely the most noticeably different thing about Closer compared to Unknown Pleasures. In fact, some of the songs don't have any guitars on them at all. The rest of the differences are fairly subtle, and there's still an unmistakable Joy Division sound, but the album still stands out on its own and not just as an Unknown Pleasures sequel. For one, the overall sound of the album seems to have a lot more space. Kinda hard to explain what that means, it just kind of feels that way, I guess. Though it could partly be because there's a shitload more reverb thrown into the mix, so at times it's like the band are playing in a void far away from civilization. And there's a more different approach to rhythm in the songs. Whilst the songs on Unknown Pleasures were generally built on the typical 4-on-the-floor beat, songs like Atrocity Exhibition and Colony are based around slightly more unconventional rhythms. Then when 4 on the Floor appears on songs like A Means to an End and Isolation, it's instead a very stiff, robotic version of it. Atrocity Exhibition, the album opener, really stands out on its own in Joy Division's discography. The song's like an early version of noise rock with its relentless, warped guitars. In fact, the guitars were originally even more abrasive, according to Peter Hook. He was actually the guitarist on this song. Him and Sumner decided to swap instruments for it, but the massive amount of effects that Hannett put on the guitar really pissed him off, though it does create an interesting sound, so I'm not really bothered. Now, I was adamant that Atrocity Exhibition was the worst Joy Division song for a pretty long time, but after revisiting it more recently, I actually find myself liking it. In fact, I'm not really sure why I never used to like the song in the first place. I guess since then I have heard some more weirder, messed up music, so now it doesn't seem as weird to me anymore and I can see past it. The track Hardened Soul was also a fairly different approach by the band, as the instrumental backing of Ian Curtis's vocals is pretty minimal, so you get rather up close and personal with Ian on that track. And just as the album starts wildly with Atrocity Exhibition, the album also ends with 2 songs, The Eternal and Decades, that are 6 minutes long and a much different musical direction for the band. Slow, sparse, and no guitars whatsoever. The Eternal is definitely the strangest of these 2 tracks, by far the slowest song the band ever recorded, and a very interesting mix of sounds. Big reverberating electronic drum hits, synths that sound like a choir of ghosts, disembodied piano, and something else that kinda sounds like a sprinkler. So those are 2 of the band's songs that help their influence stretch towards gothic genres and not just post-punk. Though the fact that most of their music was sad as shit was probably enough of an influence for goths as well. Now, out of the 2 Joy Division albums, Unknown Pleasures is probably my favourite. That used to be a lot easier to say back when Atrocity Exhibition gave me the shits. But even now that there aren't any songs from Closer that I dislike, I'd still pick Pleasures over it, even though Isolation is probably my favourite song out of both of the albums. I guess the songs on Unknown Pleasures just flow better as an album. Now, the interesting thing about Joy Division is that many of their most recognised songs, like Love Will Tear Us Apart, Transmission, and Atmosphere, didn't appear on either of their albums. In fact, they had a lot of songs that weren't on those 2 albums, as most bands do. But what's more is that a lot of these songs were fucking bangers! So this probably won't be the last video that I make on Joy Division, because I want to showcase their other releases as well. I might do this with other bands in the future too, ones that I know really well, and look at the best and worst of their B-sides and rarities. I might call those kinds of videos Beyond the Albums. So look out for that, music nerds. That won't be out too soon though, because next review is going to be on Gorillaz, because someone asked me about it on Twitter, and I think I'll give them what they want instead of doing the random wheel thing. I mean, the wheel gave me Joy Division, it's taken me a fucking month to finish this, so I'm going to change things up. So that's it. Did you laugh or what do you think of Joy Division? Do you agree with me? Comment below. And share my videos, please. And thank you.